Anyway, thank you all for coming tonight. I know most of you. I don't know everyone. My name's Susan. I live here. Thanks for being here. Take your plates back to the kitchen when you're done, please. And be nice to everyone. Ask questions. I run a company called Posthoc, and we host salons on different topics. And sometimes, well, actually, I always do salons on topics. Hi, Meredith. That I'm super interested in it, and tonight was a topic about which I know nothing and wanted to learn a little bit more. That's why we're here tonight. Dimitri, he answered a cold email. I mean, to be fair, he didn't answer really immediately.
I didn't know what to expect, to be honest with you.
Sandeep also didn't. Where's Sandeep? He's probably hiding out. Yeah. Now you have a bunch of friends from here, right, Sandeep? Okay. He didn't answer either immediately. He didn't know what to expect. Well, you know.
Well, you know, the book came out on April 30th, and pretty much every week since that, I've been doing like 3 or 4 book talks. This is the first time I'm doing it by candlelight in someone's house with live music, standing on a chair. So this is definitely a unique experience.
It's going to be the first and last.
Yeah.
We're literally on the That's nice, Oliver. So let's see what other house. Oh, Queen Esther. So for those who haven't been here before, I'll throw out 1 or 2 questions to Dimitri. We'll chat. Queen Esther will remind me she's going to sing. We'll go back and forth, and it'll get a little messy and fun. Okay?
Really messy.
Really messy. And then, yeah, and then that's the end. We all hang out. How do we want to start? Do you want to start off with a little music to
Warm up the room.
warm up the room?
Yes. So this is Sharp Radway on piano. And I thought it might be nice if he played a little something to warm up the room. This is called You've Changed. I know, right?
new book?
Liz?
World on the Brink. Your first book, too. It's like a baby.
First.
Yeah.
Right
and
now it feels like one and only, but...
Yeah, and Garrett Graff. How did you meet Garrett, your co-writer?
So I've known Garrett for about 10 years. He's a prolific writer, and I didn't want to write a book all by myself
It's
as a
scary
first
and
book.
lonely.
And he actually, so we published it on April 30th. He published it last November, a book on UFOs, and in June he released a book on the history of D-Day. And I'm like, I don't even know how you did it. I thought one was hard, but...
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so he's prolific. How America can beat China in the race for the 21st century. I felt like I'm not well enough educated. I went to school in Scotland with some Taiwanese who would come all the way from Taiwan to Scotland to be educated. The thesis of your book, generally speaking, correct me, is that we are in Cold War II and that we're marching towards a conflict with China. But before we dive into that, and I didn't ask you in advance, so you might not know any, could you give us a few stats about China, perhaps in relation maybe around GDP or their growth in comparison to America? It doesn't need to be stats, but where's China doing better and where's America doing better?
Well, today they're not doing great in almost anything. So American GDP right now is 25% greater than China's. Mm-hmm. Their growth, which had been double-digit growth for the last 40 years, has come down dramatically.
Is this like post-COVID or during COVID? Or when?
Yeah, it was starting to trend before, but after COVID, it really collapsed. It's about 4% now, you know, a little bit higher than ours, but at that growth rate, you look at the trajectory, they'll never catch up with us unless something dramatic happens, most likely here. But in terms of, you know, one interesting thing is, you know, I do make the case that we're in a Cold War II with China, and one that's actually remarkably similar to the first Cold War. When you look at the list of similarities, it's hard to make the case that this is anything but a Cold War. But I'm sort of puzzled by the people that push back on it because, one, we have kind of a good history of winning Cold Wars. You know, the track record is not bad. And two, I would argue that China is considerably weaker than the Soviet Union was during that first Cold War. It doesn't have the alliance network. It doesn't have anything like the Warsaw Pact that the Soviet Union had. It doesn't have the ideology appeal. You know, communist parties all around the world supporting them.
It has less friends, maybe.
A lot less friends. In fact, it has very few friends,
right,
if any. And you know, wolf warrior diplomacy that Xi Jinping has engaged in during his term has not helped matters. And geographically and militarily, it is considerably weaker than the Soviet Union. Soviet Union, the largest landmass on Earth. China, smaller and fully contained within South and East China Sea. This is what I think people don't appreciate is many of the reasons why China, I believe, wants to take Taiwan. Yes, a lot of them have to do with history, their view of destiny, unfinished business from the Civil War.
What about security?
But security is a big part of that. And when China looks out at the world, this is what it sees, right? And I have this map in the book. Kind of the typical map that people look at of Asia is this huge landmass that is China and this tiny speck of land that's next to it that is Taiwan. And the question arises, why is it important to them? Why is it important to us? But if you rotate the map, as we do in the book, put China on top, looking out at the vastness of the Pacific Ocean, the world's largest ocean, this is what it sees, right? To the very east, you have the Korean Peninsula, half of which is South Korea, 28,000 American troops, air bases, radar installations. Further down, the Japanese islands, headquarters of the U.S. 7th Fleet, Marines in Okinawa, and a highly capable Japanese self-defense forces. Right in the center of the so-called First Island chain is Taiwan, facing actually most of the Chinese ports and viewed as an outpost of American power, and closing down the arc in the South China Sea are the Philippines, where, you know, for the first time in 32 years, American military is getting access to Filipino military bases. So if you're China, this is not a great position to be in, where you feel completely contained by U.S. military bases, U.S. allies, and taking Taiwan actually allows them to break out of that containment, project power across the Pacific, have a blue water navy that can dominate the world's oceans, and basically do what America did, right? The rise of American superpower, I argue, began in the late 1890s, early 1900s with the buildup of the U.S. Navy. that allowed us to traverse the world's oceans, secure American trade routes for imports and exports, and really.
Well, China's been strong on trade for years, but maybe.
But it's dependent on the U.S., right? Yeah. So right now we're the ones that are protecting.
I mean, I think a bunch of people
routes.
are eating off of Chinese export porcelain tonight from the 1700s.
That's right. That's right.
But they've been doing trade. I mean, by water for a while, but not.
But if you can't
but
secure
not
your
in an
trade routes,
expansionist way, more on trade.
Yeah,
right?
China depends, by the way, on the Red Sea to export to Europe. Who is trying to reopen the Red Sea right now? The U.S. Navy, not the Chinese Navy, right? So you have a real interesting dichotomy where they're trying to replace us as the world's greatest superpower, but they're highly reliant on us to actually facilitate their exports and imports. By the way, they're highly dependent on food imports, energy imports, and the like, but also highly insecure in that we could contain them and blockade them.
I want to get to that later. Can you tell us the differences and similarities between Russia and China in terms of being expansionist or just worrying about security?
So I was one of the first folks to have predicted that Putin was going to invade Ukraine. I did that in December of 2021, months before that invasion took place publicly. And even though I did that, and I was just telling someone I had 95% confidence that this was going to take place. And as we got closer and closer, my hair was on fire that I thought the Ukrainians were not paying enough attention to this. And yet, the night, I'll never forget it, the night around 9 o'clock Eastern, when the missiles started flying into Kiev, and I was hearing from the Ukrainians of what was taking place, I was in shock. Right? Even though I knew it was coming, and I was convinced it was going to happen actually that week, and yet when it happens, you're just like, oh my God.
Were you more in shock with that, or more in shock when Wagner Group decided to go inland?
No, I wasn't in shock by that. That
okay.
was, I was paying. I've been deeply involved in the conflict and working with the Ukrainians, and I was paying close attention to what was happening with Wagner. But the actual breakout of the war, even though I was certain it was going to happen, when it happens, it's still like, oh my God,
sure.
I can't actually believe it. And that's when I actually started writing this book, because when I was doing my retrospective on what I got right and what I didn't get right, because I certainly got some things wrong, that there were 5 motivating factors that I believe drove Putin to invade Ukraine. And I believe those same five factors apply to Xi's desire to take Taiwan. First of all, it's history. And both men have this distorted view of history that these countries, these nations, Ukraine and Taiwan are not independent nations. That Putin talks a lot about how Ukraine is an accident of history. Xi has very much the same view of Taiwan. Both of them are wrong, and in Xi's case in particular, I go through the history of Taiwan in the book. There was never actually one moment, a single moment in history of Taiwan when whoever fully controlled China also fully controlled Taiwan.
Has it ever been fully independent?
It has been. In fact, the population of Taiwan, the indigenous population, is not Han Chinese.
Years ago, right? Yeah,
it's Micronesians, and they've been
no one knows too much about, right?
Well, it's small now, but actually, about 70% of the Taiwanese population, which majority is now Han Chinese, trace their bloodlines to indigenous populations. So, and there's a revival of interest in that culture, in that foods, and so forth. But there's been numerous attempts to conquer Taiwan. By the Portuguese, by the Spanish, by the Japanese, and the Japanese are the ones that actually finally succeeded in the 1890s when they conquered it. And there's actually a really interesting moment in history because U.S. involvement with Taiwan did not begin, in recent years. We have a long history of Taiwan, and it goes back to the 1800s. And when I was doing my launch of this book at a place called Politics and Prose in D.C., this storied bookstore, where you typically launch these types of books.
Great place to do a book launch, yeah. The place.
And so, I do a talk with Jim Sciutto of CNN, and then you take questions from the audience, and this woman comes up to the microphone in this kind of dumpy pink sweater, and she introduces herself as the first secretary from the Chinese embassy. Right, and she just lays into
By the way, they love salons. I have a Google News alert for host a salon, and it's only Chinese. Usually in D.C. Anyway, sorry.
So she just rips into me of, Taiwan belongs to China, has always belonged to China, and I say, I'm going to stop you right now, and tell you a little bit about history that you may not have learned in the Chinese Communist Party school that you went to, and it's about a period in the 1800s, in 1867, actually, most importantly, and it's about the U.S. merchant marine ship called the Rover that shipwrecks on Taiwan, on the southern tip of Taiwan, and the disembarking party that gets on the island gets completely slaughtered by the native tribesmen who are pretty vicious. And the U.S. does what you would expect. Washington files a formal complaint to the Chinese emperor, who ostensibly, on paper at least, owns Taiwan, and gets back a response that we don't control the savages. You're welcome to do whatever you want with them, and if you want to intervene, go right ahead. Right? And this was clearly, you just see a shock on her face because she clearly has never heard of this incident, and she was like, "Well, but the Potsdam Declaration of 1943," and I'm like, all right, you lost the argument there. But
what does Taiwan represent?
Well, so from a historical perspective, they actually have not for ages cared about Taiwan. In fact, there's an amazing quote that I use in the book from Mao in the 1930s, who basically said, we don't care about Taiwan at all. Now, what happens, of course, is that he fights a civil war with the Chinese nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek loses the civil war and flees with 2 million Taiwanese to Taiwan to establish a rival China. And that's where things go sideways, because now you have a direct competitor and a rival China that's been established on Taiwan. The civil war is not actually won because you've never extinguished the enemy.
Do they think they're a tiny bit better than mainland China?
Well, they for the first 15 years, they actually claim that they are China.
Right.
And in the UN, for example, they're recognized as the China. They had the the Security Council seat of China until 1971. So there's this inferiority complex of how dare these guys with tiny population, the tiny land, claim that they're China, right? So that's what started driving all of this. But second motivating factor for both men is destiny, their view of both their personal destinies and their country's destinies to take these places, Ukraine in the case of Putin, Taiwan in the case of Xi. And security and geography are also important, right? So from Putin's perspective, Ukraine...
Well, I mean, geography is kind of everything to some extent
it is,
for countries, right? Yeah.
So, if you look at Russia, it's got a 1,000-year history of numerous invasions from Europe.
And they need to be expansionist based on their geography.
Oh, they want to be, for sure, and they want it to be for a long time.
But based on their geography, right?
No, but you've got invasions,
we have better geography than they do.
Absolutely, with 2 oceans, right? But they've got Hitler, Napoleon, Teutonic Knights, the Poles, almost all of them going through Ukraine on the path to Moscow, and this huge landmass that is Ukraine has always given Russia the critical time to mobilize, to try to thwart these invading armies. So it's always been viewed from a defensive perspective as a critical landmass, and then obviously from an offensive perspective, if you want to expand and dominate Eastern Europe as they have traditionally wanted to do, you need to go through Ukraine, you need to control Ukraine, right? And the same thing for China and Taiwan, that Taiwan is basically the cork that keeps China bottled up. Whoever controls Taiwan prevents Chinese naval activity from leaving the Chinese ports if it wants to. And if you control Taiwan, you actually do the opposite, which is you push the U.S. out of East Asia because you compromise and endanger the supply lines to Japan, to the Philippines, to South Korea, and you start dominating that region. And the last factor that I think is absolutely vital and drives the timeline that is in this book for both men is the ego, right? They're not just satisfied with one day, Ukraine will be part of Russia or Taiwan will belong to China. They want it to happen on their watch, right? And both men, actually at this moment in time, are 71, right? So they're looking at this next decade as the twilight of their hold on power, potentially their lives, and they want to accomplish this before they pass on or pass power, whatever may result. And that's why I think the period, particularly with Taiwan, 2028 through 2032, is going to be incredibly dangerous.
Okay, yeah, I'd like to get to that as well. Is China focused more on economics or military?
So Xi Jinping is actually remarkably completely uninterested in economics, right? So the economy is a disaster. You have a huge real estate bubble. Just to give you a sense, right, at the height of 2008, real estate was slightly more than 10% of our GDP. Today in China, it's 30%, right? And you've got, I'm sure you've read about these ghost cities, enormous speculative real estate bubble that is actually a huge problem for the local governments because in China, the local governments don't collect tax revenue. they do so by selling land to developers. That's how they finance all the social programs and everything else.
So if the coastal cities are doing well, then inland might not be doing so well.
Well, it's actually across the board.
Okay.
You know, different at the federal level, but at the local level, sort of the equivalent of our states, there is no taxes, right? So the only way that the government gets money, and they don't get much money from the Beijing, is by selling land to developers. You can see how this model leads you down the wrong path, and it's a huge problem right now. He seems completely uninterested in actually solving it, in doing anything to stimulate the economy, other than just engaging in overcapacity that is becoming increasingly problematic.
What do you mean by overcapacity?
So doing things like massive production of batteries, EVs, and other things that he thinks he can dump on the world markets.
Cars, whatever, where we see the
electric vehicles in particular, right? And the problem he's facing is that there is a backlash now, not just in the U.S. and Europe, where both implemented tariffs, but countries like Brazil, India, Turkey, countries that
These
are
all
traditionally
companies that are big and growing.
friends, so-called, right? They're like, no thanks. We don't want you to destroy our own economies by dumping
And they're
this stuff.
increasingly important as they get larger and larger economically.
Yeah.
Give us a little bit of a schedule, because you kind of write out a schedule. If China was going to go into Taiwan, I want you to tell us why geographically it's going to be very tough, and two, 27, 28, and why it would be done by like 31 or 32.
Yeah, so great question. So we know that China is not ready today. This is incredibly tough to do. And I'll just give you one anecdote of why. So we just celebrated in June the 80th anniversary of the most complicated, greatest amphibious invasion of history, the Allied invasion of Normandy, right? 150, 160,000 Allied troops crossing the English Channel, about the width of Taiwan Strait, and we know how that turned out. What most people don't know is that actually last month was the 80th anniversary of a much, much bigger invasion, one that never took place. It was called Operation Causeway. It was put together by the Joint Staff in August of 1944 to invade Taiwan, where you had 60,000 entrenched Japanese forces on the island. Right after the incredible success of Normandy, you think that this is a piece of cake. We're good to go. We know how to do this. We can accomplish this. Well, the Operation Causeway called for double the number of forces that we used against Normandy, 300,000. The estimates were that we would suffer 45,000 casualties. Just to give you a sense, on D-Day, the deadliest day of World War II for America, we lost 2,500. So 2 months of very brutal fighting, and ultimately Roosevelt, General Douglas MacArthur, and others looked at this plan and said, no, this is too hard, too costly, too risky. We're going to bypass Taiwan. We're going to go for Okinawa, which is what we did. Right, so 80 years ago, for the country that has just accomplished the most amazing amphibious invasion in history, this was deemed too hard.
Like, we're not.
Everything that's happened in the last 80 years has made it even tougher, obviously with the invention of new defensive capabilities, like anti-ship missiles, radar installations, unmanned vehicles, you name it. And by the way, on Taiwan, the regular military, which should be larger, but nevertheless is 100,000, right? So larger, almost double the number that the Japanese had on the island. Plus, you have 1 million in reserves. Now, very questionable combat quality of those reserves, but nevertheless, it's a huge population from a military perspective, so very, very difficult to take over. The terrain is absolutely hellish. First, crossing the Taiwan Strait is a nightmare. Half of the year it's basically impassable.
How many deep ports do they have, or just one?
So they don't have, they have basically two, one in the north, which is in the mountains, and really, if you take it, you can't get to the capital.
You can't get anywhere, okay.
Unfortunately, the Taiwanese, literally in the last 30 years, have built a port right facing the strait and leading straight into the capital,
okay.
which I actually believe in. The book opens up with a detailed scenario of invasion, that port is absolutely a linchpin to any successful Chinese invasion. A lot of people talk about the beaches. The beaches in Taiwan are not takeable. They're very small. They can be fully fire controlled from the neighboring mountains. The waters are very rough, so getting there is very challenging. And most people don't realize this, but when we did Normandy, we didn't just land on the beaches, right? We set up these so-called mulberry ports, these floating docks that allowed us to bring...
A mulberry port? I've never heard of that
that's
term.
What
I don't know what that is.
These huge, long, essentially floating floating docks that you could see in the photographs of D-Day that allowed us to bring in all the logistics, all the armor, munitions, etc., to support a force of 150,000 initial people that we brought on land, because wars are not won by human force alone or munitions. They're won by logistics. And setting this up in the Taiwan Strait is next to impossible. If you pay close attention to the Middle Eastern conflict in the last 9 months or 10 months or so, you may remember that we set up this floating dock in Gaza to try to bring in aid. It lasted all.
That's what I was going to ask. So that's what that.
Yeah, it lasted all of 5 days.
It didn't last long, right?
Literally
it's gonna
five
take
5
weeks
days
to get there. In 4 weeks, this dock's going to be there, and then it didn't last.
Yeah, 5 days because of the rough waters in the Mediterranean. Well, the Mediterranean is a lake compared to the Taiwan Strait. So just bringing this in is impossible. You need the port facilities, and to support probably a 1 million man invasion force, right? That's how many people you need to subdue this island of 24 million people. Enormous undertaking. The Chinese have not fought a war since 1979. So all of this is to say this is really, really complicated. They're not ready. And one of the other ways we know they're not ready is that Xi Jinping, we know, because the CIA publicly revealed it, has given the order to the military to be ready by 2027, right? Now, that means that he knows he's not ready today if he's giving the order to be ready by 2027.
When did he give that order?
They didn't reveal that, but they announced that he did it, I think, about 1.5 years ago.
Okay.
So a couple things about this. 27, I don't think is a likely date for invasion for several reasons. One, if anyone's ever done any work with the government, whether it's U.S. government or other governments, you know that just because you give an agency an order to be ready by a certain date, almost guarantees they won't be. Whether it's true whether you're in China or whether you're in the U.S. Secondly, 27 is a very symbolic date, right? Why 27? Well, two things are happening in 27. First of all, it's a 100-year anniversary of the establishment of the People's Liberation Army, the military, which, by the way, is not the military of the state. It is actually the military of the Chinese Communist Party. And that's why establishment actually predates the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949. And the other thing that happens in 27 is that Xi is up for re-election in the Chinese Communist Party, so not quite like our election, obviously. Most people in China will not vote, but the party will. And while the re-election is almost guaranteed, it's not a done deal, right? And it's a real election within the party. And he needs to make sure that the support is, is there among the population of the party. And imagine him going in front of the Chinese Party Congress in probably October or November of 27 and saying, by the way, I've accomplished the one thing that Mao even couldn't do. We now have a military that is capable of taking Taiwan. Just symbolically, that is a very powerful statement. And but 27 is unlikely because effectively it's his re-election year, right? Imagine us launching a war of choice, including one that's incredibly complicated, while we are focused on shoring up, political support during an election. It's just very, very busy time.
But 2028 has a lot of distractions.
But 2028, actually, he gets past the election, right? He gets past the distraction of that. And for us,
but
2028...
we as Americans have distractions,
28
right?
is really interesting. So the year begins in January with election in Taiwan, both legislative and presidential. You have an inauguration of the president in Taiwan in May of that year. And even if the current president, who just started his first term, they can serve 2 terms there, just like ours, gets reelected, although probably unlikely because that party has been in power now for 3 terms. But even if he gets reelected, you'll still have a lot of changeover in the national security apparatus, just like we do here. People ready to go to the private sector, people move around. So you've got like a new government, effectively, that will be in place in May of that year. That summer is the Olympics in Los Angeles, so we know what we will be paying attention to. And then, of course, you have the election in November. So a lot of distractions for us, a lot of distractions for Taiwan, and potentially an opportune time to go. So I don't necessarily predict, although the book opens up with an invasion scenario on November 13th, 2028. That's done more for...
it's fun.
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 But I think the window does open up that year. It potentially closes in 32 for several reasons. One, he's going to be up for another election in 32. It's a 5-year term, Xi Jinping. And he'll be 79 at that point. Right? We just went through what happens when you get into your 80s as a leader of a country. He does not look very healthy to me, although I'm not a doctor, so who knows what shape he will be in at that point. And for him personally as well, thinking about his legacy, how long he can stay in power. By the way, Chinese leadership does not tend to elect people into their 80s. So again, because he's driven by his ego, I believe, and wanting to do it on his own watch, there's sort of a natural sort of life-limiting deadline for that.
Okay, let's pause there.
But
Okay.
the other piece here is that the longer he waits in the 2030s, the worse it potentially gets for him, because we've finally woken up.
Well, he might not be reelected by then, right?
Maybe, and if the economy continues to do poorly, there'll be more and more resistance to him within the party. But even if he does, the military situation will start flipping, because the investments that we're making in building additional submarines with the Australians and the British, the investments we're making in Guam and Japan, and the Taiwanese are making, and the Japanese are making, this will become a lot harder. So that window that right now exists, mostly because for the last 2 decades we've been distracted, fighting wars in the Middle East and elsewhere, now we're paying attention. Now, just because we decide to pay attention does not mean we can produce weapons at our whim, and our defense industrial base is kind of in shambles, but we're rebuilding, we're investing, right? A lot of that will take place over the next 10, 15 years. So the longer you wait into the 2030s, the harder it will become, right? So that window that opens up right now is going to close potentially.
Okay. Esther?
This is Wayne Tucker, everybody.
This is Wayne's first time here.
And it's his first time here.
It's actually not really his first time, because he walked in and realized he'd performed downstairs. Remember the cupping room? Yeah.
Apparently, he performed there for 10 years. Right? Wow. Okay, so I thought it would be a good idea to do this song called Things Are Looking Up. I know, right? Well, look, it's that Dick Gregory quote. This is not a battle between Republican versus Democrat, liberal versus conservative. This is a battle between right versus wrong, and right has never lost.
Well, Esther, I mean, that's very positive. Let's go.
I know, right? I can't turn it off.
Jeez.
So I put out an album called Things Are Looking Up,
Yeah.
and this is the title track. I hope you
Yeah.
like it. Things are looking up. I've been looking the landscape over, and it's covered in four-leaf clovers. Oh, things are looking up since love looked up at me. Bitter was my cup, but no more will I be the mourner. I've certainly turned a corner. Oh, things are looking up since love looked up at me. See the sunbeams, everyone beams. Just because of you, I'm confessing that my depression is unmistakably through. Things are looking up. It's a great little world we live in. Oh, I'm happy as a pup since love looked up at me. Wayne Tucker. See the sunbeams, everyone beams. Just because of you, I'm confessing that my depression is unmistakably through. Things are looking up. It's a great little world we live in. Oh, I'm happy as a pup since love looked up at me. That was a Billie Holiday rare side.
I love it.
That was a song that was popular back in the day that nobody ever plays. So I'm glad you liked it.
So the book is really the strategy of how to avoid a war and deter it. And yes, I think that there are certain part of our political establishment that wants, regime change in China. I think that's insane and impossible to do. And I'm personally done with regime change adventures. I don't know about how anyone else.
Wait. When did you come to America? Age 10, Tennessee?
13, yeah.
13.
Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah. We'll get back to that too.
But there's what ultimately happens to the Chinese system, Chinese government, is up to the Chinese people, and there's nothing we can do to control that. I'm perfectly content to keep containing them as we have been.
Should we keep them close to us and more reliant, or should we?
We should. So to increase deterrence, right? We want not to decouple. Right, decouple is actually counterproductive because if you decouple, you have no leverage. But you want to increase your leverage over them, and you want to decrease their leverage over us, right? I call this unidirectional entanglement. And we have to do that particularly in 4 critical technology areas that I think will define the path of the 21st century. They are AI and autonomy, biotech and synthetic biology, space and green energy, and 2 critical components without which you can't build any of these things, which are semiconductors and critical minerals.
And of course, Taiwan's quite important on the semiconductor front.
Just a little bit.
Yeah.
So they produce, this is a widely quoted stat, they produce 90% of the world's most advanced chips. More importantly, they actually produce 40% of all chips, every type. So it's, and by the way, that's, someone asked me this earlier, that is not going to change in the foreseeable future, despite the CHIPS Act investments that you may have heard about and the building of fabs in Arizona, Ohio, Oregon. That's a drop in the bucket.
Are we investing enough in technology in America? You come from a tech background.
Yeah,
so,
you could always do more. I think on
how can we do a better job?
semiconductors, we basically authorized $75 billion, $52 billion in grants, another 25 or so in tax breaks. That is literally a drop in the bucket. Like a modern fab costs $20 billion, just to give you a sense. You're not going to build a lot of them. Now, they're attracting private capital. It's not just government money that's going into this, but the number of fabs in Taiwan, the capacity cannot be eclipsed anywhere else, and also for the cost. So this is a trivia question for you, and whoever I talked to earlier cannot answer it because they know the answer. But guess what? In Taiwan, so TSMC is the biggest chip maker in the world. In Taiwan, guess what they pay on average? They're top-of-the-line process engineers, people with PhDs that design these super complicated processes to actually cook the chips, right? Any guesses in U.S. dollars?
80 grand.
Any other guesses?
$500,000 a year.
500,000. Okay. Any others?
wow, I was gonna say like 30. I don't know.
35.
Okay.
35,000.
Yeah.
These are PhDs. Like, tell me in America where you're going to find a PhD willing to work for that
No wonder
much.
we've got so many university
So
programs.
cost of living in Taiwan is really cheap. If
Yeah.
you want to go there, everything is ridiculously cheap. Like a nice suit you can get for $50. Real estate is very expensive, and that's why a lot of them actually live with their parents. But aside from that, you can absolutely have a great lifestyle for $35,000.
You come from a cybersecurity tech background originally. Are there, and the Chinese are known for going in and stealing IP at universities or wherever, in companies. Are there any like international norms around cybersecurity?
Well, norms are great, only
Or
if they can be
laws,
enforced.
or yeah, I mean.
So we do have.
It's a new world
From
to
the
some
U.S.
extent.
perspective, we do have norms that we've been trying to push for many decades.
But do we have allies having the same?
By and large,
Okay.
the French are not exactly on board with, this idea of economic espionage should not be done. Others mostly are. But look, there's no enforcement. So the Chinese keep doing it, and we're doing nothing to stop it, nothing to punish them for doing it. I argue that we should. But that's why I've called it the greatest transfer of wealth in history. For the last 25 years, they've stolen everything under the sun in every major industry and given it to the domestic industries. It hasn't always panned out, but in many cases it has, right? It's no accident. They have the world's biggest and greatest telecom company, one of the world's top social media companies, one of the some of the best TVs in the world.
Any thoughts
right?
on what should happen to TikTok, ByteDance?
So it's not at the top of my list of things
that you're worrying about.
That we're worried about.
It's in the press a lot, right? A lot of people use it.
But
So.
I think there should be divestiture, purely from the perspective of if you're Instagram, if you're X, you can't be in China, right? So why in the world would we let them come here?
Right.
Just from a pure reciprocity perspective. And if they don't, that's great. But if they want to operate here, you can't be a Chinese company, right? There's also a media ownership issue that I think has not been talked about much. So I think TikTok is effectively a media company, right?
Yeah.
Yes, the content is user generated, but the algorithm decides what you see and more importantly, what you don't see, right? Things disappear off the platform all the time. And you don't know, is it because it's not, someone took it down voluntarily or because the platform decided that they don't want to show it to you. And if you treat it like a media company, you come under media regulation laws in this country around media concentration that we've had on the books for decades, right? So the first law is around foreign ownership, right? So, and it primarily concerns TV networks because that's the age in which it was adopted. But when Rupert Murdoch came to this country from Australia and he wanted to buy the Fox network, not Fox News, but the actual network, he was prohibited from doing so until he became an American citizen, right? Even as an Australian citizen, he could not purchase the network by law. And secondly, if you want to go out and buy all of the local TV stations in this country, you can't do it, even as an American citizen. More than 39% is prohibited from a media concentration rule perspective by the FCC. So with TikTok, you've got a foreign owner owned by essentially a company that's operating in an adversary country. And two, sort of self-admittedly, they say that they reach half the American population, right? So both on concentration level and foreign ownership, I think
and
they
it's
fell
young
test.
people.
Yeah, so now I don't think it's a huge threat. I'm not an alarmist about it, but from a pure fairness perspective, why would you let them do this?
Let's talk about age in China and here, but really in China and how that's going to affect China moving forward.
Well, so demographics, right?
Yeah.
Their demographics are terrible. By the way, so is ours. They have about 1.4 billion people today. They're losing several million every year now. And that will continue and accelerate throughout the decades. By the end of the century, they'll probably have about 550 million, which on one hand, you can look at that and say, oh my God, this is a demographics collapse. And by the way, most of them will be elderly. From a deflationary perspective, this is a complete nightmare. On the other hand, the other way to look at it is 550 million is still greater than what we have today, 330 million. So it's still a lot of people, right? And from a military perspective, it will still be a significant power. From an economic perspective, it will still be very significant. So it's important to look at that trend. It's important not to overstate it and what it means for us. And by the way, if we didn't have immigration, we would be in decline just as China because birth rates are down everywhere in the developed world. So
how does immigration affect China? In
well,
terms of people coming in?
They don't have any, right? So I do argue that this is
there
one
are
of
foreign
the
workers there, though.
You know, I'm biased as an immigrant, but this is one of the enormous advantages we have in this country is the people that are coming over here. Now, I don't think that this should be done in a controlled fashion. I think that we should attract the best and the brightest. I like the quote by Scott Galloway, who said that every year there's a draft for human talent, and America gets the top picks, except we don't actually use them because it's so hard to come here legally. And but the fact that we have until very recently, with some of the changes that the administration implemented at the border, you had 4,000 Chinese nationals coming across this border every single day this year. And some of them are probably spies infiltrating us, but vast majority are probably people just looking for a better life for themselves. Well, there's no Americans jumping over the fence trying to get into China. There's no anyone jumping into China except the North Koreans, and they're only there transiting, trying to get to South Korea, right? So that attraction is that we have is absolutely unbelievable, despite all of our issues. And it's easy to focus on our polarization, our inability to get anything done in Washington, and so forth. This is still the place where people want to come, desperately want to come, and are going through enormous hardships and risking their lives and their children's lives to get here, and we shouldn't lose sight of that.
Is NATO well suited to averting a world crisis these days?
Well, NATO does not really have a big role in the Indo-Pacific. In fact, most people don't realize this, but NATO alliance actually by its charter is constrained to the Atlantic area. So in fact, most Americans don't realize this, but actually Alaska and Hawaii are not covered by the NATO treaty because it's defined by geography. So if there was a hypothetical attack on Hawaii, we couldn't actually legally invoke the NATO treaty. And similar for example, with the French, they have holdings like New Caledonia in the Indo-Pacific. If they are attacked, we're not under no obligations to protect them and defend them. Now, practically, it doesn't really matter because NATO is much more of a political institution than it is a legal one. In fact, most people also don't realize this, but the Article 5 of the NATO treaty, the famous self-defense clause, has so many loopholes you can literally drive a truck through it because it basically says that every country is obligated at doing what it deems necessary to respond to an aggression against another country. So, if you deem that it's not necessary, then you don't have to. Right. But practically speaking, if that were ever to come to pass, it would be the end of NATO, right? So politically, it's an important promise. But it's important, obviously, to deter Russia. And what I've argued is that the Europeans, who have willfully underspent on defense over many decades now, because
they just announced? Oh, today they announced they're going to spend more on Ukraine.
Yes, but still very small amounts compared to what we do. Even though their economy of the European Union at large is about the same as ours, but they are happy to live under American protection and American umbrella while they're investing in their social system, while they're investing in their economy, while we're like chumps, spending it on their defense. But if what I've been trying to tell European leaders that I've spoken to is that if America goes to war with China, right, we're actually not going to ask you to do a whole lot because you don't have the capability to do what's necessary. So we're going to be working with Australians, hopefully, the Japanese, maybe the Filipinos. But what we need from you is to deter Russia from doing anything while we are over there. And by the way, not only are we over there in terms of our naval presence and our Air Force, but a lot of our supporting infrastructure, our so-called ISR, intelligence surveillance, reconnaissance assets, both satellites.
I don't know what ISR stands for.
Intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance, basically ability to collect intelligence on what's going on. Satellites and everything else is going to be tasked over there. Our tankers, our logistics, that's all going to be focused on the Pacific, where we would be engaged in this massive battle with China. And the Europeans are completely reliant on all these assets. They have no independence whatsoever. So sort of like you realize that we'll leave some army brigades there, but other than that, we're gone. And it's up to you to make sure that Putin doesn't try anything. And they don't have the capability to do so, unfortunately.
Esther.
This
You're
song
welcome.
is called,
That's what a salon's all about, creating culture.
This song is called Officer Friendly, What Happened to You? When I was just a little girl, Officer Friendly came to my school. I thought that he was so cool when he got down on bended knee and explained it all to me. He said he catches the bad guys, they're everywhere, doing bad guy stuff, but it's the cops that really care. He said he's there to protect me, 'cause my daddy just can't do it on his own. And I believed him. What happened to you? What happened to you? What happened to you? What are you going through when you lie and you swear that you're telling the truth? Then you hide all your evil when there's all this proof. So many trigger-happy murderers And in the big city, I look, but I can't find an officer friendly. So much murder and mayhem I see he gets up to with the rest of the officer friendlies in blue. There's so many thin blue lines that are tangled, so many lives that those blue lines have mangled. The little girl in me is confused and undone. Are you chasing the monster you've become? What happened to you? What happened to you? What happened to you? Look what you put us through when you kill and destroy lives and say we're to blame. Were you always a victim, a pawn in this game? Were you always like this and you lied to me too, Officer Bradley? What happened to you? What happened to you? What happened to you? Thank you.
Let's do a few questions, and then we'll just move over to chatter and music. And yes, Ned?
You emphasized naval power in two different ways. One is China's motivation for taking Taiwan, and you analogize that to American naval projection in the 19th century and the 20th century, and also in discussing the invasion. But look, naval power isn't what it used to be, and there are other kinds of power that are way more important than they used to be. So why do you think this naval power why does it play such a big role in your thinking?
Well, I disagree with that. I think that naval power for the last 3-4 centuries has been absolutely vital, right? It underpinned British Empire's rise. They didn't have a huge landmass. They didn't have a huge land army.
They didn't have airplanes.
What's that?
They didn't have airplanes then.
Sure, but you can't subdue countries and you can't secure trade routes across the ocean with air power alone. And to this day, we're relying on our aircraft carriers, we're relying on our destroyers, literally in the Red Sea right now, to try to escort shipping through that channel. And China is absolutely reliant on imports and exports, mostly through the oceans, right? This is why, in the Ukraine context, the most devastating thing that the Russians had done to Ukraine, other than killing so many of their people and destroying their electric grid, was shutting off Black Sea exports, because you can't be competitive with rail exports. The cost is orders of magnitude higher, and it's absolutely vital for imports and exports at a relatively cheap price to use modern-day shipping containers to import and export. So naval power, I believe, remains vital. And by the way, the critical piece about naval power these days, particularly in great power context, are submarines, right? Because surface ships have become more and more vulnerable and easily discovered. And this is another problem that China faces, because the depth of the waters all around its shores, both in South China Sea and East China Sea, is very, very shallow. In the Taiwan Strait, the depth of the water is only 300 feet, too shallow to even put a submarine in. On the other side of Taiwan, that first island chain, it's 12,000. So taking Taiwan and establishing deep water ports, and particularly submarine bases, on the other side of Taiwan, eastern side of Taiwan, is absolutely vital for their submarines to be able to go out into the Pacific on patrols without being tracked by the U.S. Navy.
Can you tell us other deep ports around the world that China now has control of due to, maybe giving loans or?
Well, they're building facilities. They're building facilities in Pakistan and East Africa, and financing facilities in Latin America. But they still have to get there.
Yeah, they have to get there.
Right, and the problem they face is, literally, if you look at the map, they're contained. And they have to get through that containment, either in South China Sea or in East China Sea, through choke points that are controlled by the U.S. Navy. And again, this is not I don't even make a moral case of U.S. versus China. It's purely from their perspective. They want to be the world's greatest power, which, by the way, for much of human history, they have been, right? Up until the Industrial Revolution, they were the richest, most powerful country on the planet, right? And they've only lost in the last few hundred years, from their perspective, because of opium wars and what they call the century of humiliation of white colonialist powers. And they think that they're reemerging to their rightful place as the world's preeminent superpower. If that's your view, you can't let another power, like America, have that much power over your imports and your exports, right? Which are absolutely vital to your survival.
How important is space in all of this?
Well, very important, which is why I said it's one of those key technologies. There's been an amazing revolution in space in the last 15 years, primarily driven by two capabilities. One, reusable rockets and broader, cheaper lift into space, allowing us to bring a lot more mass into orbit. And the other technology is the development of these small satellites, CubeSats and larger satellites, that you can put in enormous numbers, right? SpaceX has a constellation of about 7,000 satellites. About 2/3 of all active satellites in orbit are SpaceX satellites that have been put in there just
Constantly going out,
in the last
like by
10
Santa
years.
Barbara, yeah,
right?
once a month.
And you couldn't do that with these humongous school bus-sized satellites that we used to have that cost $1 billion or more to produce, right? So lowering the cost of lift and lowering the cost of the satellites themselves, with which you can do all these low Earth orbit stuff now, with Starlink providing communications, with these so-called SAR satellites that can penetrate clouds and see down deep into what's going on around the world, and navigation, all those sorts of things that you are now relying on for satellites. It's been really revolutionized in the last 10 years. And we're leading the way, by the way, so this is a huge advantage to America right now.
Question? Yeah.
You've sort of like alluded to this, but I would love to hear you speak about it more directly. Even just in the subtitle of your book, it seems like the book is predicated on the idea that America should win the Cold War.
Yeah, because I'm an American. I want to win. It's my team.
He is a very enthusiastic immigrant. It's amazing. You really believe in America.
I think most immigrants actually
They all
have a much
do.
greater
Yes.
faith in this country than they do in
100%,
America.
100%.
Because, by the way, we've seen the other side.
Yeah.
The grass
You're
is not
here for
greener.
a reason. You're here for a reason.
This country is not perfect, but boy, I tell you, it's way better than most
Okay,
others.
Sammy, go. Okay.
But
The contrarian view.
well, no. Just I'm wondering, like, your position on it seems pretty clear, but I'm wondering what you think would be sort of like, if China did win the Cold War, like how would that cascade in global policy? Like what would that leave our world looking like?
Yeah. So what does it mean to win the Cold War? Let me paint that picture, because I think it is an important issue to discuss, and really goes into the heart of the issue that we didn't actually address, which is why is Taiwan important, right? And we have, to the extent that Taiwan is even being discussed by people, it gets reduced to chips. Right, which
Well,
I
that's
think,
what I was asking. Like, what does it represent?
Yeah, but that's a very, frankly, insulting view of Taiwan, because Taiwan mattered to America long before the age of computing. I mentioned in the 1860s we've had encounters there and attempts to land forces there and do actually a counterinsurgency campaign, which failed on the island past that rover incident. But 1950. Douglas MacArthur said Taiwan is, or Formosa as it was called at the time, is an unsinkable aircraft carrier, signifying its geopolitical importance. But the other thing is, like, if you're going to fight for Taiwan, chips can't be the answer, right? You're not going to tell an American soldier that you're going to go die for chips. Like, that's just not going to be acceptable. But you might tell them to die for the greatness of America and preserving the world order that we stand for. And here's what's going to happen if Taiwan falls to China. Let's forget how, right? Whether it's an invasion that they succeed at, or we don't intervene and Taiwan just falls. But you will have an immediate change to the order in East Asia. First of all, our presence, military presence in East Asia, particularly on the Japanese islands and South Korea and Philippines, will become unsustainable because of the threat to our supply lines presented by China and their submarines in particular, but also sonar installations and missile batteries they can put on Taiwan. So we'll be pushed out of West Asia all the way back to Hawaii. And this is not a hypothetical. I've had conversations with senior officials in those countries what they've told me is if Taiwan falls, regardless of how, you choose not to fight for it, you fight or lose, this will change everything for us, and we will now have a new sheriff in town in East Asia called China. And it's not that we're going to give up on our alliances with you, it's not that we're going to stop trade, but we now have a new sheriff that dictates the rules of the security order and trade order, and we're going to have to accommodate them because you're not going to be far away. And it's not that I think China will be on some sort of Hitlerian march across East Asia, and after Taiwan, it's going to take Japan or Philippines. Look, in 1945, it would have been very, very hard for us to take Japan. No one has taken Japan now. Not us, not China. It's too hard. But you don't need to invade countries to dominate them. After all, look at Russia, southern Ukraine aside, Russia dominates its near abroad. Whether your country's in the Caucasus, or your country's in Central Asia, when Russia says jump, the only answer they get is how high. Because you have no other choice. If you're Uzbekistan in Central Asia, you're sandwiched between China and Russia. America's far away, it's not going to do anything for you. So what do you have as options? Nothing, right? So you're going to do what they want in large parts. And you're going to try to figure out some sort of semblance of independence by trying to play those two big powers against each other. That will be Japan, that will be Korea, that will be Philippines. And the problem is that East Asia is absolutely vital. You have almost 50% of the GDP in Asia. You have most of the supply chains, most of the population, most of the economic growth. And allowing China to set the rules of that order, trade order, is going to be a diminishment of American power and increase to theirs. And they're going to use it as a springboard for expanding their already sizable influence around the world. So it will be a retreatment of America, the end of the American century, I believe, the start of the Chinese one. And ultimately, you'll probably, again, an authoritarian China, a confrontationist China that they've already been, even though they're still a weaker power, once they view themselves as a stronger power, I think we're on a path to potential war anyway. So that's why I think Taiwan is so important to our interests.
Why did your family move to America?
Opportunity. And by the way, we left in 94.
You were 13 and what were your parents
Yeah, we were in
doing?
94. It was after the fall of the Soviet Union. Russia was democratic. But this was the greatest country to grow up in and to live in, to start a company. I founded a huge company, CrowdStrike. I couldn't have done that anywhere else in the world. And we raised $25 million over a PowerPoint deck. Tell me where in the world I could do that. We joke we made about 25 slides, about $1 million per slide. We should have made more slides. But the market, right? I tell companies, and I'm an active investor now, companies in Europe, I say, get the hell out of Europe and come here as soon as you can because this is the market you want to be in. And most American companies don't understand Europe. I've been through numerous rebuilds of Europe for American technology companies, and they go into London and they say, we now have Europe, right? It's not Europe, right? 28 countries, numerous languages, different cultures, different channel strategies, different go-to-market strategies. The beauty of America is you sell in Alabama the same way you sell in Seattle, the same way you sell in New York. One huge market, the biggest market in the world. So easy to scale companies here. You don't have that anywhere else.
That's great. Yes. I can't
Easier to
remember
raise
the name. We
capital
just
here
met.
than anywhere
Okay.
else. Yeah.
Josiah.
First time Salon
First time.
guest, so he gets to ask a question.
Thank you. I was tempted to ask you about the Deepwater port near the capital, which seems mysterious why they would give their idea a foothold. But I want to ask you a bigger question.
Well, I'll quickly answer it. It's because it's much easier to carry goods into the capital, so it was built for economic reasons.
What is the body politic in China, if there is one, feel about Taiwan? I feel like during COVID, we saw the non-elected government there somewhat responsive to the feeling of the people. In Russia, we've seen that the population is very willing to bear the price of a war the government's waging. Would there be a cost in China among the people to wage a war against the U.S. and the West and Taiwan, and would that matter?
By the way, on Russia, another trivia question for you. So people ask me all the time, how many people has Russia lost at this point in Ukraine? No one knows exact numbers, but realistic estimates are probably around 140,000 dead, and about 3 times that number wounded. When they were fighting in Afghanistan in the 80s, they lost a total of 15,000, right? And I remember it growing up in the 80s in Moscow. There were huge protests. soldiers' mothers and so forth, and none of that is happening in Russia right now, and people ask me, why is that? Right? And this gets me to the trivia question. Do you know what one of the top Yandex, which is their equivalent to Google, searches is in Russian right now? Any guesses? All right, this is a hard one to guess, so I'll say it. How do I send my husband into the war zone? This is the attitude right now, right? And it's completely understandable. The one difference...
That's depressing.
God,
you came to the right country.
So a couple differences between the 80s and...
Not how do I find a husband?
and today. First of all, in the 80s, the Afghanistan war was fought with conscripts. Today, Russia is largely, they had one mobilization wave, but largely fighting with volunteers that are signing up, getting a huge sign-on bonus, a big salary, particularly for rural Russia, and an amazing death benefit, which is, you see where this is going, right? So if you're a woman in rural areas, so no one in Moscow and St. Petersburg is fighting, right, and some of the other large cities, but in rural areas where your husband is probably an alcoholic, probably abusive, doesn't have a job, sign-on bonus, death benefit, and you get him out of the house?
Yeah.
Sign me up, right? So this is the difference that's happening now. So it's all about how you structure the fight, right? And, you know, if the Chinese are smart, now it's a conscription military today, but, you know, how they evolve will be interesting to watch. But my point is there are ways to manage it and address it, which Putin has done very smartly in Russia. Sorry, what was the other part of the question?
How much pain is the body politic there?
Oh.
Is it part of the collective myth that Taiwan is part of, or is it a top-down?
Yeah, I mean, the mythology is very strong, right? It's been created by the CCP over decades, and there's a huge sense of nationalism. And less like even interest in taking Taiwan, but more of like, America won't let us have it? Like, this is our right, like, how dare you? People may not like have deep affinity for Taiwan. Most Chinese have never been there, but it's still like, it's ours, right?
Yeah.
You know, how dare you give it up or not let us have it? So that is important. Now, in the military, I think that there is very little appetite for this because they know how hard it is. They probably, if they had their say, would probably say no thanks. The problem is that they don't get a choice. That just like in Russia now, this is a one-man decision. Xi Jinping has completely consolidated power. If he decides to go, they're going, because there's no one there to say no.
Jack, oh my gosh, so many questions. We're only going to do one or two more, but you're not leaving immediately.
Okay,
you can
yeah.
take question hour in the
sure.
office.
I have a question as a service member and as someone who grew up in service. Like my grandfather was Vietnam, Purple Heart.
Yeah.
My dad,
Which branch for you?
Army.
Yeah.
So, as someone.
So you probably completely disagree with me on naval power.
I had the opportunity of going to a liberal school, and I've heard the conversation with both sides. I have an econ background to understand the economic angle, but I guess to a service member, or in general, like understanding that with the sort of layout that we have, geography speaking, like we can't be invaded really as a country, you know. So we're not really fighting for our initial protections, more the abstraction of economic interests, right? How would you make a case to service members in order to sort of follow along this alignment that American interests in this foreign land in a forest space like matters so much to us?
Well, it's a great question, and you know, obviously, after the last 20 years, it's a particularly hard one to make the case for because we have squandered a lot of goodwill by doing things that we should never been doing. But you know, we've made that choice several times before for good reasons. World War I, World War II, Korea, and you know, in 1984, Reagan gave the speech in Normandy on the 40th anniversary of D-Day, and he said, you know, we had made a mistake as Americans back then to let Hitler capture all these lands across Europe and then, at terrible cost, try to retake them before it was too late. And next time we shouldn't wait. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. He was much more eloquent than I am. But you wait too long and the problem does come here. And particularly, I think, a China that is dominating East Asia economically and militarily and stretching out from there will inevitably, I think, come into conflict with us somewhere, potentially closer to our shores. And eventually you're going to reach a point where you're going to say enough is enough and we're going to make a stand. And I would argue that making that stand now while they're completely contained geographically and we're the ascended power is much more preferential. And look, I'm not for war. Look, a war with China, almost unimaginable in terms of losses and economic devastation, by the way, on the scale of global depression. We have to deter it. Right, there are three possibilities here. He goes and wins and takes Taiwan. He goes and loses, and he doesn't go. Right. The last one is the Goldilocks option that we should do everything in our power to prevent, and I think we can. The book is very optimistic. We were talking about this earlier.
Super optimistic, yeah.
I think we're much stronger than they are. They're much weaker than we think they are. And secondly, the stakes for him are really, really enormous. And this is the one difference between Ukraine and Taiwan. I've argued for the last 2.5 years that Putin can make the decision tomorrow to say, victory achieved, you know, I've denazified, whatever that means, demilitarized Ukraine, I'm pulling out. All the lands I've captured, I'm going to give them up. He can do that tomorrow, no one in Russia bats an eye, because no one really cares about this conflict. For Xi, he doesn't have that option. It's a pretty binary outcome. You go and you win, or you go and you lose.
He cannot screw up.
And if you lose, it's probably the end of him, probably the end of his life, likely the end of the Communist Party in China. So the stakes are really enormous. So when he goes, he needs to have great certainty that he can win. And that's the benefit that we have, is that if we create as many dilemmas for him as possible about the cost of this conflict, both military and economic, I think he's deterrable.
Would you say there's an incentive then with that line of reasoning to instigate?
That's what I was just thinking, but I thought I couldn't
To
ask any more
instigate.
questions.
I mean,
Yeah.
I see on both sides on his end, right?
Trick him into
The
it.
economic gamble of going all in and betting on Taiwan might lead to Chinese supremacy in the long run.
Yeah, but you're risking your life. You're risking the, your position in power. You're risking the Chinese Communist Party. That's a lot to gamble.
But I'm on the way out. I'm out. It's 5 years, 9 years, as he said. And then on the other end, don't we have an incentive of instigating that if there's a potential political gain?
Well, I don't think he wants to go down in the history books as a loser that lost China. I mean, I think that's a big driver for him, that ego of going down into the pantheon of Chinese history and saying, I've accomplished the one thing that Mao couldn't do, take Taiwan, right? And losing it all is not appealing. Which one?
Owen, one more, and then you're not going to leave any. Owen.
I'm hoping you could tell us just a little bit about the decision matrix that the U.S. is staring down around like nuclear deterrence in Taiwan. Like I feel like I historically we've seen like giving nuclear weapons to our allies in Europe for deterring Russia as being, at least from my perspective, not in military strategy, as being pretty effective on that side. A little bit different with Ukraine,
Yeah.
but like it seems like giving nuclear capable submarines to Australia wouldn't that.
Well, they're not nuclear capable.
Oh, they're not.
So they're nuclear reactor powered,
Oh, understood.
but not without nuclear weapons. So we've never actually given nuclear weapons to allies. We have stored nuclear warheads in various places under our control.
Okay.
And we've let them develop delivery platforms like F-16s and F-35s that they could theoretically fly to drop these weapons, but again, on our orders. They couldn't do it themselves. So we've never relinquished our nuclear weapons for obvious reasons, because we don't want to cause a nuclear war, or if we do, we want to be the ones causing it, right? So, if the question is, like, should we give weapons to Taiwan? I assume that's where we're going?
Yeah,
Or,
I mean that's kind of the
yeah, so just not realistic practically. So there's no way they're going to be watching this and saying, we'll just let it happen. That's when they invade, right? That's a red line for them. And so that's not a realistic option.
Thank you, Dimitri. Thank you so much for your opinion
Thank you.
and expertise.